Lower Merion Township is steeped in history. From the very beginnings of our Commonwealth to the industrial and transportation revolutions, suburban development, and into the present. One of the most significant treasures in this long story sits on a high hill just outside Bryn Mawr. Witness to the beginnings of the Commonwealth and our nation, this most historic of homes serves as a memorial to an American patriot, but also tells the story of Lower Merion, and indeed the nation itself.
This building was built by a Welsh Quaker named Roland Ellis. And Roland Ellis was one of a company of gentlemen who bought 5,000 acres in the wilderness outside of Philadelphia. So they got 10 acres in Philadelphia, 5,000 acres in the wilderness. Roland Ellis took 700 of that 5,000 and he built this house beginning in 1702 and completed it in 1704. You won't find his name in any history book. We don't have a portrait of him, we don't have a drawing of him, we don't have a piece of his clothing, we don't have a letter from him. He was a justice of the peace, he was a tax collector, he was a translator for his Welsh neighbors in the marketplace. He was a very, very significant member of his Welsh community. He had a farm. He wished to have, of his 700 acres, he wished to have 40 within fence within a year. So you're talking somewhere in the late 1690s. He had a small farm. Early on, cattle were a big crop, as well as grain crops as well, but both livestock and grain crops. The name of this property, this house, was Bryn Mawr. Bryn Mawr is two Welsh words that mean high or great hill. That was the name of this property in this house. This was a very, very sophisticated building for 1704. It's a big house, it's a very sophisticated house, it's a very pretentious house. It has high ceilings, has big rooms. There are 2 closets in every room in the house. If you have closets, you have stuff. If you have stuff, you have money. The house is a T-shape with 2 rooms in front and 1 in back, and it has a balcony on the front of the house. William Penn visited Pennsylvania twice, and in his second visit in 1699, he wrote a letter home, and he said, "I can't believe how big my town has grown. There are more than 300 houses in Philadelphia," if you can imagine that. 300 houses in Philadelphia, and all the best houses have balconies on them. All the best houses have balconies on them. And there is indeed a balcony across the Pent-Eve, across the front of this house. It's essentially a Jacobean style. The exterior of the building is very forward-looking into the 18th century with balanced end-wall chimneys, the central doorway, even the balcony on the second floor is centered on the facade of the building. So it's looking forward into the 18th century in architectural styles. But when you come inside the house, you walk in the front door, you're walking into a building that's 100 years earlier. You walk directly into the common activity area of the house, known as the Great Hall or the Common Parlor. The Great Hall in castle architecture is the common activity area of essentially a village. There are stables, there are bakeries, there are parade grounds, there are dormitories, and then you have the Great Hall or the common meeting place. And in domestic architecture, such as this, the Great Hall or Common Parlor serves the same function. It's the principal activity area in the house. I tell 4th graders if they had had television, they would have watched it in this space. On the ground floor, the house is built on something called a hall and parlor plan. The simplest house plan is 1 room. The most common house plan of the 16th and 17th, 18th centuries is the 2-room plan, the hall and parlor. So you have the common activity area, the hall, the Great Hall, and then you have a parlor next door. The back room on our T-shaped building is a separate kitchen and a bedroom above. So again, this is a big fancy house. There was no separate dining room, but there was a separate kitchen, again with high ceilings, and it was a large, large space. gone through a whole series of different operations on this farm. Roland Ellis went into bankruptcy, and he had to sell the property. More properly, a man named Richard Harrison bought out his debts, and Roland Ellis moved across the river to Gwynedd, where he lived with his daughter. So Richard Harrison bought out the debts of friend Roland Ellis, helped Roland Ellis out. He had married a Philadelphia girl named Hannah Norris. The Norris name is a big name in Philadelphia. So Richard Harrison marries this Philadelphia gal, Hannah Norris, and he brings his slaves and grows tobacco here, brings his slaves from Maryland and grows tobacco here very successfully from about 1719 until his death in 1754, 55, 56. And his widow received the property. A single woman could own property, buy and sell property, own ships of trade, own a business, own a trade, be a tradesperson. If she married, those rights, property rights, went to her husband. So Mother Hannah dies and leaves the property to her sole surviving child, Hannah Harrison, who hadn't yet married Charles Thompson. So Hannah was actually the owner of the property from July until September, and Charles Thompson became the owner of the property when he married Hannah. They married in 1774 on September 1st, and then on September 4th, he is called to be the first and ultimately only Secretary to the Continental Congress. The property was rented by tenant farmers from about 1760 until Charles Thompson retired from the Congress in 1789, so that it was an income property for them. He was busy in Congress. He was running all over the place. They had a house on the Ridge Road called Fairhill. Then when the British occupied Philadelphia, the British burned that building, and Congress left and then came back to Philadelphia, and the Thompsons owned a house at what's now 4th and Spruce. So they didn't move here until July of 1789. Of course, after the Revolution, we had the Confederation Congress, of which he was also the secretary. Congress had moved to New York in the 1780s, and he was in New York. And he either arranged his way to go to Mount Vernon and tell Washington he was the new president, or was asked as the secretary of the Confederation, the old Congress, to go to Mount Vernon to tell General Washington that he had just been elected under the new Constitution of the United States of America. Bring him to New York so that he could take his oath of office. And an interesting thing happened. Washington took his oath of office in April of 1789, then he went home. And so did everybody else. There was no more government. So they all left town. Here's poor Charles Thompson trying to run a government, run a country without any support. And so he was there for about 8 or 10 weeks, and the new representatives started to arrive, and Washington came back. And so he submitted his resignation to George Washington, and it was accepted. So he retired from the Congress at age 60 and moved back here to his wife's property, his property at Harriton. And he wanted to be a farmer and return to his classical studies. He had two interests: America's principal industry after the Revolution, agriculture, and a return to his classical studies. He moved back here. He was here by July of 1789, and there's a letter at the Library of Congress that he writes to Hannah, who's in Philadelphia. She was not with him. And he writes to Hannah and he said, well, I've arrived at our place called Harriton. He said, I had to hitchhike on the back of a farmer's wagon. This is the end of his glorious political career. He hitchhikes on the back of a farmer's wagon, and he had to ask the farmer to set up his camp cot and his tent and go find some eggs and bacon for dinner on this old farm, because the house was in such terrible condition that he couldn't sleep in it. Hannah's here by October. The house is being fixed up and painted and repaired. The front room is being wallpapered for her, the parlor. The great hall or common activity area of the house becomes his library or study. And he throws himself heavily into the management of the farm, letting it out on shares. And that's not sharecropping in the nasty sense in the early 20th century down south. It's more like profit sharing. So you start with Roland Ellis and subsistence farming. You then have a heavy commercial agriculture on the slave economy, tobacco farming with Richard Harrison, and now you have a profit sharing situation with Charles Thompson. He was a founder of the Philadelphia Society for Promoting Agriculture, which is in existence today as the oldest continuously operating agricultural society in the country. He also wrote a book called Notes on Farming, in which he talks about the management of livestock and crops and fields, drainage, all of the things that go into the management of a farm in the new and scientific way. Charles Thompson was a beekeeper from early on, and as early as 1783, when Congress was in Princeton, he writes home to Hannah, who had apparently written him a letter, and the farmers here at Harriton had turned the beehives upside down. Somebody got stung or something. They turned it upside down. And Charles Thompson wrote back and told them to be much more careful with the beehives. They were very important and useful little animals. And then he described how they should take care of the beehives. So this is 6 years before he's living here, and he's directing what's going on at the farm. When he retires here, he is a beekeeper, and we probably understand a lot more biology than he did. But he did understand that when there were honeybees on the landscape, his crops, and particularly his fruits and vegetables, did better. So he regularly admonished farmers to use these useful and productive little animals. It includes a whole section in his book, Notes on Farming, about beekeeping. This year we have 8. And we got 200 pounds of honey. We do not sell our honey. It is not processed in an official licensed processing facility, so we use it for publicity purposes, special gifts and that kind of thing. We do run workshops, beekeeping workshops. We do it with kids beginning at age 11 in our summer camps. We go down and we extract honey. And it's always seems to be the most exciting day when the bee inspector comes. They love to talk, and the kids will dress up and sit down there for hours with the bee inspector. And they're mostly retired fellows who just love to keep bees. He also turned to his second interest in retirement, which was a return to his classical studies. And here in his study, in what had been the Great Hall, or the Common Parlor, Thompson made the first translation of the Septuagint, or Greek version of the Bible, made the first translation from page 1 to the very end into the English language. Other translators as early as the 1400s had used bits and parts, but no one had ever started at the beginning and ended up at the end. What's also remarkable about this achievement is that he had it published or printed by a woman in Philadelphia who's considered to be one of the first woman publishers in America. And she's the first woman in the world to print a Bible in English, or print the Septuagint in English in North America. And the paper for that Bible was made right here in Lower Merion by the Bicking family, the Bickings having a paper mill down on Mill Creek. He was asked to write a contemporary history of the American Revolution, being the one person who was involved every single day, from day one until he took the news to George Washington that Washington was the new president. So he was the obvious person. He was the record keeper. He published the minutes of Congress. He was the obvious person to do it. And the story is, the tradition is, that he wrote 1,000 manuscript pages, which he then burned, because he understood that this was a great new country, it was moving forward, and he decided that he would not destroy people's images of the heroes that had been made. Franklin was already a hero, and by the 1790s had died. Washington was a hero, had been president, had been a general, got us through the Revolution, but he had died. So by the early 1800s, Thompson thought, I'm just going to let this go. I will not, and in his words, I will not undeceive future generations that this was not an act of providence, but was an act of men with feet of clay. He died here at Harriton at the age of 95, August of 1824. His nephew was living here with him and his children, and it was a rather unfortunate end to Thompson's life because I think we would have liked his character. And he became the owner of this property upon his marriage to Hannah Harrison. He became the legal owner of the property. And he recognized that if she had predeceased him, which she did, this property would descend legally through his heirs. So he established a trust in 1798, whereby if Hannah predeceased him, this property would descend in the Harrison line. So Charles Thompson established that he would give up his rights to this property. And some of the Harrison heirs were looking at Charles Thompson. You're several generations away, with Thompson being 95. Some of them are looking, they want their inheritance. And they see John Thompson cutting timber on the property for his own account, not necessarily for the farm's account, not necessarily for his uncle's account, doing damage to the property. He tore down some buildings here. And so Thompson and his nephew were sued by some of the Harrisons. And Charles Thompson died on the day they were to be in court. He got the best of them. And indeed, upon his death, this 13-year-old girl inherited the entire estate. The family never lived here again. This became a tenant farm, an income property for this child, who grew up to have 3 daughters, and then the property descends through them. It was a tenant farm. This young girl, Naomi McGlenigan, 13 years old, inherits the property. What's a 13-year-old need 700 acres of property for? So it's managed for her by a series of trustees. She marries a man named Levi Morris, and they pretty much lived downtown in Philadelphia and out here at a new building further up Old Gulf Road. And this old house, built in 1704, becomes a tenant farmhouse. And there are a whole series of tenancies that go on through the 19th century. And we have most of the leases and documentation for all of that work in the 19th century, all of the management of the farm. We have almost every single day right through the 19th century. The last tenant moved out about 1907 or 8. There had been a fire in the big barn, which was across the driveway from the house. That was rebuilt with some insurance money. And the branch of the family that received this end of the property, it was essentially divided in 3 parts. Very simply, this end, which we call Harriton, the middle, which we today call Beaumont, the retirement community, and the far end on the other side of Ithan Avenue, which is now developed in 1999 as a residential community. And this branch of the family said, what are we going to do with this property? It's now the 20th century. There are some people moving into the suburbs, but there's also something going on in the agricultural industry of southeastern Pennsylvania. And Guernsey dairying was a huge industry. A lot of people got into it. And in Lower Merion alone, there were, prior to 1930, there were not less than 24 dairies or bottling plants in Lower Merion Township alone. And so dairying was a huge industry, and Harriton became the Harriton Guernsey Dairy. It was a high-end Guernsey dairy farm until 1929. Little lots started to be sold off, and in 1927, the dairy farm, the majority of the dairy farm, was sold to a man named Ralph Colton. And Ralph Colton was an architect, the up-and-coming young architect in Philadelphia. And he bought the house, put the dairy farmer out of the old house, fixed this house up for himself and his family, and this was going to be the light on the top of the hill, the Bryn Mawr, the high hill. And he was going to develop houses on a lot of the little roads we know below us, Penstone Road, Woodleaf Road, and was going to develop those as residential places. The dairy business went out of business. The Depression is what finally killed it. But the stringent regulations, requirement for pasteurization, so forth, all these things worked against having cows instead of houses in the farm fields. But unfortunately, he was killed. He was boat's nuts, and he was killed in a boating accident on Labor Day weekend in 1931. So he didn't get to enjoy it very long. He had started developing houses down on Woodleave Road. That sort of went out of business with the Depression. And the house sort of just survived during that Depression period. Of course, then you come to World War II. The family didn't really live here again, and the property was put up for sale. And the house, the historic house, 1704 house, and 4 or 6 acres were sold to a couple named Frank and Alice Mahan. Frank was a real estate agent. He was a Bryn Mawr boy. He was a real estate agent in Bryn Mawr. He and his wife bought the house and several acres, lived here, and they sold it to Lower Merion Township in 1969. There was a sign that went up along the road on land that they did not own. It was still owned by the Colton family. And it was a red and white sign that said, "Land ripe for development." And there were those neighbors who were really afraid that this last big chunk of ground would disappear into houses. And the Harriton Association was founded to make sure that that didn't happen. The association raised the first $100,000 or $200,000 that was used to buy this property, and then the township bought the other parkland with park bonds. And that's what created the park that we know today. Harriton Association, the nonprofit, is the legal partner of Lower Merion Township. And the township has no facility at all for managing an historic site, and that falls to the legal partner of the township, the Harriton Association, and we're responsible for the maintenance, management, preservation, and interpretation of the site on behalf of the township and the public. So that's how we get from Roland Ellis and his 40 acres under fence to where we are today. Philadelphia is a city of associations. We are the Harriton Association that manages this property. That was not unusual. Philadelphia associated itself for all kinds of reasons. Philadelphia Society for Promoting Agriculture, of which Thompson was a founder. Again, in the middle of the 1780s, there were groups of gentlemen who would get together and they'd have talks and lectures and speak to each other about the newest agricultural methods coming along. And as I said, agriculture was America's principal industry after the Revolution. There were societies for manufactories. There were all kinds of organizations, little guilds, bookbinders guilds and goldsmiths guilds, sort of leading into the union system that we have today. But people associated themselves in Philadelphia for lots and lots of reasons. And interestingly, that has changed as our communities have changed and our cultures have changed and as our demographics have changed and people have worked themselves away from that sort of community spirit and associative nature. And people sometimes ask me, what's a Harriton Association? What's the association about? And originally in 1962, it was an association of neighbors and friends and relatives who got together, associated themselves with the mission of preserving this house. And Philadelphia has a long, long tradition of associations and community spirit. We talk about settlement to suburb. What we do is we were reflecting on 300 years of change here. And Harriton today recalls those 300 years, both locally for our local heritage. The Merion and the Welsh tract were still Lower Merion. So we speak about the Welsh, we speak about the changes, about agriculture here right up into the 1950s in this community, certainly until 1930 here at Harriton. And we also reflect on Charles Thompson's place, and that's the focus of the restoration. The historic house is a wonderful bit of architecture. It's a very unusual and rare survival of domestic architecture in Pennsylvania. Very early, very pretentious building form. And so by itself, it stands up and is worthy of preservation. But it was the home of Charles Thompson, and there's very little other place where we can talk about Charles Thompson. His other homes are gone. And this is the place where he spent the greatest single number of years of his life, 35 years here. And people would come to visit him and recall that process of the American Revolution. And so that's what sort of the broad view of Harriton is, that settlement to suburb. And we go actually right past Charles Thompson and into the 19th and the 20th centuries and 21st centuries. We're the longest surviving democracy in the world. And they didn't get everything right coming out of the box, is what I tell fourth graders. They didn't get everything right. But we have a system that allows for change and allows for growth and allows for the ability to correct prior wrongs. It allows everyone to participate. And that's the importance of telling the story. How did we get here? What makes this the oldest continuous democracy in the world? Why does it work? And it's about the people. It's about the people who created it, and it's about the people who live in it and support it. That's why Harriton's important. That's why Stenton Mansion's important. That's why the Philadelphia Museum of Art is important, which brings together not just American art, but art from all over the world, right into contemporary art. And it is worthwhile, and it brings back those associations that we've gotten away from.